Welcome to the Modern Husbands podcast, where any combination of Dr. Bruce Ross, Christian Sherrill, and Brian Page host national experts who share winning ideas to manage money in the home as a team. I'm Brian Page, founder of Modern Husbands. Sometimes our listeners want more support than a podcast can give, individual or couple support, which I now provide. Details can be found at modernhusbands.com. For today's podcast, we welcome Dr. Gary Barker and Dr. Taveeshi Gupta of Equimundo. Dr. Barker is the CEO and co-founder of Equimundo and a globally recognized leader in engaging men and boys to advance gender equality with over 30 years of experience across more than 50 countries. Dr. Taveeshi Gupta is the Senior Director of Research at Equimundo and a global expert on masculinities and gender with over 15 years of experience leading research on structural inequalities and their impact on youth and development. Our conversation will center around Equimundo's State of American Men 2025, a groundbreaking new study that offers an unflinching, data-driven look at the emotional, economic, and cultural pressures facing American men. And one statistic that derives from the research is going to shock you. And it's an absolutely terrifying statistic. 57% of men and 52% of women believe that the U.S. would be a better place with a strong leader in charge who does not bother with elections. The stakes of what is occurring in our country right now couldn't be any higher. Now on to the show. Gary and Taveeshi, I'm really excited that you were able to join today's Modern Husbands podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I want to dive straight into it because I know that we have a lot of great conversation that lies ahead based on your your report that you just released and some really important details to share out with our listeners. So Gary, if you wouldn't mind, let's start with how does the deep sense of economic anxiety experienced by men in the U.S. relate to their support for authoritarian government and restrictive ideas about manhood?
Yes, you're starting with a big question, right? What is the sense of economic precarity or anxiety, as we've called it? I mean, I like to start with a quote that we saw online as we were also looking at the online lives of young and adult men. And the quote was more or less this: a guy said, "Hey, fellow dudes, how many of you have this feeling that you're not going to be economically as far ahead as your father or your grandfather, and you don't know what to do about that?" And there followed thousands of likes and comments and "you hit it, guy." And I think that says a huge amount, right? This kind of, because the American dream, if we want to call it that, this idea of home ownership and some economic stability and some money in the bank for either a private pension plan and Social Security, and both if you're lucky, and a sense that it was okay and you can hold on to this. That certainly has been promised to middle-class white men forever, and promised more to men of color as well and to immigrant men. You know, the current reality that we're in is really shaky. You are not wrong. You're objectively right to worry about your economic future. And for men, it's so tied as well to the sense of who you are. Because, you know, and Taveeshi will share some data points on that one as well. Although we've loaded lots of other things onto being men, we expect men, you know, and you look at this, Brian, right, in your own role in life, men are finding a lot more meaning in being caregivers these days and lots of other things that we want to do and that are expected of us. But the thing that tops the charts is being a provider. And it's not just the economic side of it, right? And so economic anxiety or economic precarity is not just, do I have enough to make ends meet to make it through the end of the month? Will I go bankrupt if I've got an unexpected health cost or another cost in the household? But it's also the sense of there's a stable future so that I can form a relationship with somebody, that I'm interesting to that person to want to form a relationship with me, right? We're seeing a huge amount of young men stuck in terms of not forming relationships. And that's both on the part of a would-be partner, majority heterosexual, who say, look, dude's not very interesting if he, you know, is not optimistic, if he doesn't have a stable economic future. And guys themselves, weighing themselves, comparing ourselves to our dad's generation, our grandfather's generation of where are we financially. So it's kind of like you took a perfect storm and you threw, you know, AI into it. You threw a general sense that The world is unsteady. And you've got a president who's, was threatening tariffs, and now he's doing tariffs. And the economy, to those who are doing well off, feels uncertain. If you're middle class, lower income, it feels really, really unstable. Taveeshi and I are both developmental psychologists, and what we know, we used to think about it mostly around young children, that you need a sense of stability. You need a sense that you're well held, that the world is looking out for your well-being. We now know you need that throughout your life cycle. That's how we thrive. And perhaps one of the simplest, kind of conclusions from our field of developmental psychology is, without hope, we don't thrive. And that's not just like a presidential campaign slogan. It is what we need to get ahead as people, as humans, with others around us and this wider world around us. Men right now do not feel the world helps them thrive. And I'll stop on one more quote that I think, kind of makes that, and then hand it over to Taveeshi, or back to you. One of the other questions we asked, this first time we ever asked this, was, do you think, we said, no one cares if men are okay these days. Fully 3/4 of men affirmed that. They don't think the world around them cares if men are okay. More than half of women also affirmed that. That is, they said, yes, we don't think as well that the world really cares if men are okay. It is really hard to thrive if objectively the economic world around you is unstable. And then if you also feel the humans you need around you to thrive don't care if you're okay, it's a perfect disaster for you to fall prey to all the stuff that Trump used to get elected and that the MAGA right has used to say, no one cares about you, we got your back, tear it all down. And it's not just them, it's also lots and lots of voices online. I'll be more optimistic on the next question, I promise. This is a particularly gloomy one, but I think it needs to be said and looked at.
Well, I led with that question because it really sets the stage for the broader conversation of where we are right now. And what has me concerned about that data point from your research is that it almost feels like a vote of desperation, that they're willing to hand over. There's more than half of men asked are essentially willing to hand over democracy for the promise that authoritarianism, which is what essentially the question was asking, whether or not you would prefer authoritarianism over democracy, the belief that authoritarianism is going to lead to a better life for men. And what terrifies me about that is we know the journey of authoritarianism is rocky at best, and we know the destination is catastrophic. And when you also consider the fact that the strategies that are being employed right now run counterproductive toward the end goal, like GM, for example, last week reported terrible earnings because of so much of what they purchased to produce their cars is being tariffed. And it's making cars more expensive. And this isn't new. I taught economics for 15 years, and I find it baffling that a regressive tax, meaning it hurts the working poor and the middle class more than upper income folks, which is all a tariff is, that is employed on products that we need to produce here, is going to make it even more restrictive for future labor opportunities for blue collar workers.
Yeah.
But the other thing I wanted to point out as you were walking us through that journey of where we are is that a lot of this isn't new. I mean, we've seen this, it's called the Great Risk Shift starting in the early 80s, where companies went from pensions to 401ks, right? Where all of a sudden health insurance was pretty affordable to now it's really expensive. And what did American families do since the late 70s? Well, there was a second income earner. Like women took on the quote flexible jobs. Yeah. So there weren't as many disruptions for men. Men didn't feel it. Women felt it, but men didn't necessarily feel it. So the only difference between now, what the household income necessary to provide for your family now and then is really that there are more female breadwinners.
Yeah.
Right? And women are outpacing men as college graduates. And so you hit the nail on the head where when money and masculinity are married, what's being really threatened right now is a man's sense of purpose in a relationship, because we have yet to expand what it really means to be a provider beyond money.
Yeah.
Gary, in what ways is anxiety about financially securing their family's future linked to a lack of purpose, increased suicidal ideation, and feelings of being an inadequate caregiver among men?
Yeah. Oof. I think what we, marry this sense of economic anxiety and purpose with the fact that we saw lots of younger and young adult men saying, no one really knows me. Young women said that, and women said that as well. But for men, it was much more highly associated with having thought about suicide in the previous couple of weeks. So what we do see, and again, kind of all these things, it's important to say, they affect women too. The effects on men we see even more acutely, and we think for various reasons. So one of those findings is that men who face financial instability are 16 times more likely to have thought about suicide in the past 2 weeks. Women who face financial instability are 7 times more likely to have thought about suicide compared to other women who haven't faced financial instability. So we're not doing well for men or women, but it's more acute for men. We think a lot of this is it's not as if mental health issues and anxieties kind of fall pretty evenly across the population. Men and women, for example, in national data we have, or that CDC has rather, show that rates of depression are pretty much similar between men and women. It's the way they get manifested and the fact that men don't tend to seek help. So you've got a sense of men's social disconnection, particularly the youngest generation of men, and particularly men who are non-college graduates, who are tenuously connected to the job market, and particularly those who are unmarried or not in a stable relationship, which is a lot of guys now between the ages of 15 and 24. So all those things meld together. Financial instability doesn't cause depression. It leads to anxiety. And if you've got other factors that might predispose you to depression, it becomes that ripple effect. So what we see deeply and urgently is this need for particularly young men who are not, the kind of neither working nor in a training program nor in university, group of young men who across ethnic groups, I think it's important to say, who desperately need a sense that somebody's got their back, that someone cares whether you're okay and is able to reach out and connect to you. And even the opportunities that are there, we find that this particular group of young men is unlikely to take it because they've gotten down into the spiral that it's not even worth trying, or their connection to a job ends up being really short term. They may start a training program and then drop out because of this sense that they didn't feel connected. And they're kind of that sense of personal connection there. We hear a lot of questions from those who run training programs, Job Corps, et cetera, like, why don't guys stay involved in it? Why don't they stay connected? We're having trouble asking the affective questions. What do you need to feel like someone here cares about you? And it's not just, put the ad up and say, we've got this program for young men. We've got to figure out a way that young men feel seen, that we help them kind of practice their social skills. Sometimes we'll call it their care muscles, their social muscles. Young men, particularly are showing, I'll go stick with that metaphor. Young men particularly showing kind of their social skills being atrophied. Part of that being online so much, part of that the lingering effects of COVID, part of it fearing they're going to be called out, they're going to mess up, and therefore better just to be quiet and look at the ground, look at the floor, look at my phone, look at my shoes, anything but look somebody in the eye. So all those things we believe kind of creating this layered crisis of connection, to call it that.
Given that both men and women believe being a provider, and I'm going to say financial provider, is a key trait of manhood, how does this expectation contribute to poor mental health in men? And what is the paradoxical link to a better sense of purpose in life?
Should Taveeshi jump in on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I can talk a little bit about that. And, Brian, I think one of the things that we have consistently found, and it's not just us, this is a big body of research. There's tons of scholars who have done this work, is that there's something called the man box. And
Yeah.
it is a set of very rigid norms that are expected out of men to be masculine, right? To be men, essentially. And it's not even about being very masculine, just an unsaid universal expectation. These are norms of masculinity. And they fall on this kind of spectrum of being hyper independent, being physically tough, being emotionally stoic, all the things that we call stereotypes, essentially. And so we, in the past many years, and have collaborated with colleagues who have termed the name Man Box, we've developed a scale that actually assesses men's agreement and disagreement with these norms of masculinity. And the way we kind of, when we do the analysis is that we are seeing whether men are in the man box, that is, whether they agree and strongly agree with these statements, or they're outside the man box, right? Whether they disagree or strongly disagree with the statements. And what we have found, not just in this study, but we did this study a couple of years ago as well, is that the paradoxical sort of relationship that you're talking about is that the more men are in the man box, the higher their reporting of sense of purpose in life. And that is deeply counterintuitive to what we would like the findings to be, right? Essentially, we would sort of say, well, the more you're in the man box, you shouldn't actually have a strong sense of purpose. But when you start kind of unpacking what are the reasoning behind it, it actually does make sense, because essentially the man box are a set of rules that if you conform to them, you are considered manly. You're considered like, masculine. You're considered like you're part of the group. And the whole idea is they're in some ways like a social currency for men, right? And so it does make sense that when you're saying that, hey, I'm actually following all the things that I'm supposed to be following, I'm going to feel like I've got a better sense of purpose in life. Unfortunately, very things that they're following is disconnecting them from all the things that are actually good for them. So whether it's relationships, whether it's emotional expression, right? Whether it's anything that's actually healthy, it's disconnecting from them from that, which is why what Gary was talking about are those suicidal rates, those very high suicidal rates. So being in the man box is, while it's sort of showing them a better sense of purpose in life, it's self-reported. It's actually also providing them with like disconnection from healthy partner relationships, romantic relationships, of belief that no one's ever going to love me, right? We have a statistic that says the youngest men actually believe that no one's going to ever love them in their life. And so this idea of social disconnection, mental health, as being related to being more in the man box is what we are continuously finding. And it's got historical roots, because when you think about what it means to be a man, we are trying to complicate and nuance it, because really, right, like the whole idea is that's actually what it means to be a human. We may want to sort of binary and dichotomize and say, well, that's what's, feminine and that's what's masculine. But actually, it comes down to being human, caring, empathy, connection. These are all traits that allow us to be humans, allow us to thrive. And there's a ton of research out there, for example, by Sarah Hrdy, who's a sociobiological evolutionary psychologist. She found that Homo sapiens survived as a species only because of our ability to have empathy and connection. Right? So like if we understand how core and important these skills are for us as just a species to survive, we will no longer gender them. We've gendered them over time. And so this idea of being a provider, which is financial, you might have heard this, I hate this term, but like men are hunter-gatherers and women are nurturers, right? It's a very like kind of very old school social psychology term. And that's just the way in which the world has kind of divided up our roles as men and women. And so, just sort of to say that like the man box is something we've been studying for many years, and we're finding it to have these paradoxical outcomes, but there are reasons for those paradoxical outcomes. They're actually not that good for you. So just because you're showing that you have more sense of purpose in life doesn't actually mean it's doing a good job for you as men.
Well, I find it's paradoxical, but I also believe it's completely rational, because if you're in the man box, it's very simple. Your success is quantifiable.
Yeah.
It's easy. You simply look at the amount of money you're earning, and then the support and appreciation is visible. You accumulate wealth, and it's very easy to recognize success in those terms. Whereas what we're talking about in trying to understand how we can expand what it means to be a provider, those are intangibles that you can't quantify connection and authenticity.
Yeah. But interestingly, go ahead. Sorry. was going to say we had some interesting interviews with men in addition to the survey talking about this, and they not necessarily in those words, but they see that. So particularly some of the men who had run, a lot of which is a lot of men in the US who had run into walls of being out of work for an extended amount of time, or a career that didn't pan out the way they wanted it to, able to articulate, although they didn't get kind of external points for it, how much being connected to their children gave them a sense of feeling good about life. And heard a couple of guys kind of doing these almost like mental, contortions to feel like one of them saying, I'm a conservative rural Christian man. And, or, but I love taking my kids to school every day and
Yeah.
picking them up. It's like I'm seeing them grow up in real time. And then he'd say it again, but I'm a conservative Christian man, kind of trying to say, I need these things to get points for being the real man I think I should be. Life made me have to do this, and I'm finding great meaning in it. But he kept having to kind of, it was like he was kind of quickly trying to put on a mask of somebody that he really wasn't. And always, just again, kind of always doing these contortions to sort of be, I can't find my meaning there, but I am finding meaning there. So I think there's something for us to lean into, that it doesn't seem to take a lot of a push to get men to realize the shallowness of the financial happiness that we think is where it lies.
Particularly when the opportunity cost of that is the time that we miss with our kids, because we always can earn more money, but we can't get our time back.
Yeah.
Listeners have told us that they love the ideas we share on our podcast to manage money in the home as a team, but want more help than one episode can provide. That's why I'm excited to announce On the Same Page Consulting for corporations, couples, and individuals. Visit modernhusbands.com and click Our Services at the top of the page to learn more about how I can help you or your employees manage money in the home as a team. Again, that's modernhusbands.com. Now back to the show. Taveeshi, how does the historical anchoring of male masculinity in the provider role intersect with increasing economic precarity? And what impact does this have on men's sense of self and self-esteem?
Yeah, I mean, we've been able to touch upon it a little bit, but I think it's really important to understand why is economic precarity showing up in such a strong way in our results right now. So I think, it's not, as you said, right, Brian, it's not new that there hasn't been economic anxiety and that there hasn't been a worry about, am I going to make ends meet? Am I going to do a good enough job to be able to sort of send my kids off to college and all those things, right? It is not new. But sort of thinking a little bit about the historical, as you said, the historical underpinnings and the historical timeline, often we've been able to sort of relate this economic anxiety or this instability to some one macro shock, whether it's a world war, whether it's something else, right? And at the moment, we are in a time of what a lot of economists are calling polycrises. It is really hard to pinpoint what are the things that we can, typically address and say, well, this is why this economic anxiety is happening. Everything from climate change to, as Gary was pointing out, the rise in artificial intelligence, to changing job structures, wages not keeping up with the housing boom, et cetera, et cetera. There are so many, kind of factors that are driving people's belief that, what? It's not whether I'm going to have a paycheck. It is that I don't know what is the linear path anymore.
Yeah.
In order for me to get that paycheck, in order for me to feel that I will have some future possibility. So I think it's really important for us to sort of understand, what does this economic precarity mean, right? It is not just about being able to put a meal on the table. So what is happening, and we're seeing so many different sort of, if you could call them sectors, right, from education to health, that are seeing the ripple effects of that. So for instance, we are seeing globally, boys are now dropping out of schools. They're not completing their education, which was not the case, right, some years ago, where we had a lot of kind of very important resources and investment into trying to get girls to finish schools, their secondary schools, right, their high schools, etc. And now we're seeing this sort of huge shift where boys are no longer completing schools because they're trying to get into the labor force. They're trying to get into jobs quickly because it's impossible to say, Is my high school going to give me a job that's kind of value add to me just getting a job now without my education? As you mentioned, girls are outpacing boys in college enrollment rates, right? So we're seeing these sort of shifts happen in so many different spaces. And then when you talk about these historical underpinnings of masculinity, right, we're saying, well, that's what your job was. You were a hunter gatherer. You're supposed to be the one who goes out there and is the primary earner of the family. You are the one who's supposed to put food on the table. When you sort of, in some ways, pull the carpet, the rug from their feet beneath, right? But you don't actually have a solution. You don't actually know how to provide them with that pathway to say, this is what you need to do in order to find that stability that you're looking for. And then with the rise of sort of online world, social media, all you're hearing about is get rich schemes. And so we actually have like a statement in the survey that says, my job doesn't give me status or reputation. It is, and we put that in there. Gary and I thought a lot about it, and we said, you know what? It is because this traditional idea of having a job, fine, it's not even about just the money. It's that it is disrupting their sense of masculine identity, right? Getting a job in the office, it's just disrupting the sense of, it's no longer the masculine thing to do. We've got, tech bros making statements like more masculine energy is needed in the workplace. So, when all these kind of factors come together, of course, it impacts the ways in which masculinity has been historically understood, and of course it impacts their sense of self-esteem, and their sort of understanding of like, what is my identity, what am I good for, who am I supposed to be. What Gary was alluding to earlier is really important, which is that men who are caregivers actually have a 1.5 times more sense of purpose, right? And so this like desire to find a sense of identity is becoming so much more important. Where do they find that? If they don't feel seen, if they don't feel heard, if they feel like no one's understanding them, and the online world is not necessarily, giving them those role models, then what do you do? So just to sort of, broad scope answer your question, yeah, these changes in the world are impacting men's sense of self and self-esteem, particularly as it relates to their sense of being a provider.
I think there's one thing I want to add to where we are in time, specifically the fact that, economic precarity is the source or the origin, or at least there's correlation to what we're discussing now. And that's in the last election, we had an inflationary crisis that I guess you could argue that there were modest factors that you can tie to the Biden administration, but those same factors could be equally tied to the previous Trump administration. Basically, it's the cash during COVID that was provided. But frankly, when you look at the data, the entire world had an inflationary crisis.
Yeah.
We outperformed the entire world in fighting it back. The Economist said we were the economic envy of the world by 2024. And when I would have these conversations with folks and explain this, they didn't care. They just cared about the price of their groceries. When I explained that really the entity who's really responsible for managing inflation is the Federal Reserve. Most people didn't even know what that was, what their role was, how it operated. And so it was just like, groceries are expensive. This guy's telling me that it's going to be less expensive and men need to work more. And this is what it means to be a man. And then he wins. Yeah. And that seems like those things all tied together. So without going too far down that rabbit hole, and again, Gary, feel free to jump in. I know I'm asking Taveeshi questions now, but Taveeshi, what percentage of men identify, quote, providing for my family as a top trait they should possess? And how does this compare to women's views on the same trait for men?
Yeah, I think it's, and Gary, please do jump in when you want to on this as well. I mean, it's so interesting. We did not ask men and women to rank these traits. So the question that we gave them was, hey, in your opinion, what are the traits that mean manhood? And it was a spectrum of traits, and it's come from existing, national level surveys that the Pew has employed, a lot of the study that we have done in the world. And it had everything from like being a friend to being caring to being a provider so it was like the entire spectrum, right? And we did not ask them to rank it. And this really just came out of the data organically. we had 86% of men chose being a provider. And that emerged as the highest chosen trait by men. And we had 77% of women choose being a provider as a definition of manhood. And that also organically emerged as the most picked trait. And so this was just, in 2025 in the United States of America, if you are seeing that out of this range, we had 15 types of traits that people could pick, they picked being a provider. It really did give us a bit of pause. And sort of that is when we began to kind of unpack and say, okay, what does this mean? And we had already put in those questions on economic precarity, and that came out as such an important factor and driver. And so, I think the piece that Gary was talking about earlier is it's so important to have women's voices in our data. For this reason, this is not about just how men think about men. It is how the society thinks about men and expects out of men. And we need to sort of see it from that angle if we really do want to reframe what it means to be a provider. Right? Gary, just wanted to give you space to come in as well.
Sure. And, I think I'll use that word, the affective side of it, right? Taveeshi mentioned before we had some 40% of the youngest men who said they don't think anyone will ever love them.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're measuring your self-worth and you know that women are measuring your worth as a potential partner on how you can provide financially, I mean, this is existential stuff. Do we find someone to love and someone to love us, and feel like we can start the relationships that we want to have. I was particularly struck by some of our conversations with young men who, in the face of this sense that one, they're a little worried they're going to get called out for some, sexual misconduct. And that's a real feeling that they have. And then there's a sense that women don't find me very interesting because I'm being held up to this ideal. So there's the physical ideal that now dating apps, put you up against. You're not just like, do you like me compared to the neighbor? But I'm looking at you compared to, all the best looking male specimens are out there. Men have been doing this with women forever of comparing, what do they look like compared to others? But, men don't do very well in this sense that they don't feel they've got their own identity, and they don't think, they can convince young women to care about them in the context of a heterosexual relationship. So there's, I think there's this deep feeling that, nobody cares about me, nobody sees me, and I might not ever find somebody to love. Add those, and then if my identity tied with a sense of economic security that I'm not finding either, it's all just this deep pileup. And I worry if I'm sitting across from a 17-year-old, which is in this moment in your life, you need to be able, to explore, what am I going to be in the world? What opportunities are out there? Sexually, my intimate life as well as my economic and my vocational life, and that they feel already that it's kind of closed off to them. All these opportunities closed off. You can then see how much, and Taveeshi alluded to this, how much it's not hard to nudge you toward voices online that say, you're the victim, you see? And women don't like you, and here's what you should tell them, and you got to go after what's yours, right? It's those opportunistic voices online that are making money off of this, and because the number of followers is determines how much they get paid every month at the end of when YouTube sends them a check. That's that is what we're up against. I do not believe that any of those young men went looking for the angry version of manhood, and our data finds that as well. Most guys are going online for fun, connect with others. The smaller numbers go in there to vent frustration and anger. If we don't throw gasoline on their anger, but say, hey, dude, we got some ideas here, and we care about you deeply, and we want to have that conversation with you, that takes a while. The influencer, the moderator, the podcaster who says, you're right, dude, you're the victim, and ratchets up, the rhetoric in a second, you can watch the minnows swimming after those voices online. So that's to me, that just multi-layered complexity of it.
Yeah, I've always found that it's been easier for me, or at least more of a default response from pain is to turn to anger instead of self-empathy and solutions.
Yeah.
And those are two very different paths. And there are a lot of factors that kind of force us into one direction or the other. I think it's well stated that when you're turning to online sources that have perverse incentives to latch on to that anger that you feel when you're in pain, that it just not only makes the problem worse for men, but it magnifies the problem and multiplies it.
Yeah. And anger is, right, it's the one that we allow men to express, right? We do lots of conversations with boys and young men about which emotions they feel they're kind of allowed to and feel able to express. Anger's at the top, right? Sitting with, it's okay for you to feel anxious. This is like, if you're not anxious in today's planet, you're really not paying attention. So, right, to be able to lean into that one of like, it is okay for our sons and daughters to feel anxious. Our job is to help them feel safe and supported in this, but we've got to reinforce that. But, we keep, and the number of, adult women that I'll talk to of like, he's either silent or he's angry. Or he's talking about, NASCAR racing, or he's angry. that we've got to help men feel, just as you said, right, to feel like just a bit of self-care here. It is like it's normal in this economy, in this world at the moment, to feel like it's all out of your control. Rather than raging about that, how do I find others that we make sense of this, and we support each other, not in running to tear down the Capitol on January 6th, but to say, what do we do to build our communities? Because we're all feeling this way. And our kids and our partners and our fellow, our coworkers are all feeling this similar sense of anxiety. What is it that we can do together rather than, a kind of a rage against the very, the very policies and collective solutions that hold us together?
Well said. Taveeshi, to what extent do men and women agree that it's harder for their generation to achieve financial security compared to their parents' generation? And how does this perception influence their outlook on careers and home ownership?
Yeah, we surveyed about, almost 2,400 people in the United States. So it was quite a good sample. And we had 78% of women and 75% of men in that sample agree with that statement, that it's much harder for my generation to feel financially secure than my father's generation. It's really talking about that economic precarity that we've been, sort of mentioning throughout.
That's because it's true, though.
It's absolutely true.
Yeah. When you look at it, really comes down to the price of housing.
Yeah.
Housing and exactly, and the wages not keeping up and
correct.
all of
Yeah, that the distance has grown between the two, right?
Exactly. So it's not surprising that we see, right, more than a quarter essentially agreeing with that statement. And so we didn't do this like deep dive in the study, but I did check the correlations, and we find that the more you feel that it's harder for your generation to feel financially secure, the more you agree that home ownership is out of reach. The more you agree that my job doesn't give me status or reputation. So like the things that we've been talking about, we are finding those things to be positively correlated, which essentially means the more you feel and you agree with one, the more you feel and agree with the other as well, right? And so, I mean, it's clearly like a sort of an overall feeling. These are all the statements that we put together to call economic precarity. That's sort of our, in stats speak, our scale, our measure that we used to define economic precarity. All of these things come together.
Taveeshi, what is the correlation between men's agreement with the statement, quote, I am not in the career I wanted when I graduated from school or college, end quote, and their likelihood of feeling that, quote, life is full of meaning and purpose?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we did a bit of this analysis, and we found that for men who are 25 and older, the more they agree that they're not in the career they wanted, the less they are to also agree that life is full of meaning and purpose. And again, it makes complete sense. Gary and I were, doing some interviews in some parts of America just a couple of months ago, actually. And what really came out was this, like, if you have to sort of distill it down, it's this like, I had a dream, men had this dream, boys had this dream that I want to do this in my life. And then they go out in the real world, whether it's college or whether it's a job. And then that, that real world, it's not about just sort of like not being prepared to deal with the real world, but it is the fact that, as we've been talking about, right, those pathways that they were told should give you success are not holding up. And so many of the folks that we spoke to actually changed jobs, changed careers, compromised, had to come to a space where they say, all right, this is what I'm going to end up doing. Maybe this is probably what I'm not that's so good at. I'll probably end up doing something like this. When you put that within that kind of framework of pressure, I would use the word pressure of being the primary earner or the only earner, or like, sort of the one who has to make ends meet. It's a lot for anybody, for any human being to have to kind of cope with. And this is in the US, Brian, but we have been doing this study of economic stress globally over the past 20 years. And so across the multiple countries that we study, this idea of economic stress and being the financial provider come up over and over and over again, and they have the same directionality. And this idea that, career and job and the ways in which you feel about purpose, they link in the same way, like no matter where we go and where we study it. It's not just Equimundo, like anybody who studies it finds that. So these are very real correlations that we're seeing both in the US and internationally.
Yeah. The recent jobs reports that, Trump fired the messenger over.
Yeah. Scary, by the way.
Scary,
that's very
right?
Scary, yeah.
Yeah, I don't like this data, so you're out of here. It doesn't go with the narrative I'm trying to sell you. Showed just how much, particularly traditionally male areas of employment were stalled or going backwards. Tech was one of the big ones, right? That we've kind of told lots of young men, and no shortage of young women, hey, do computer engineering, do something related to tech, you'll have jobs. It's falling madly, even as AI, valuation of the, now the two most valuable companies in the world are driven by this, this mass and the amount that's being raised in financial markets for the AI world that needs fewer people and continues to both concentrate the power and wealth in fewer folks. And many of those same folks telling us this is going to be a massive era of prosperity for all of us. We'll take away the mundane jobs that don't have to be done. No one is saying what are the jobs that we're going to offer that give purpose, financial stability. As we say, you don't need these jobs. It feels if you take a step back from it and can look at it kind of with some degree of lucidity about it, right? It is very frightening. And if you're not able to step in it and step away from it for a moment and look at it, it feels, it feels urgently and in the middle of your gut frightening. And then sort of anybody who comes along and promises you, I see the anguish you're facing. I've got it for you. You kind of begin to suspend belief. You're not even asking about the outcomes anymore. You're just like, yeah, he gets me. He's throwing gasoline onto that fire that's already raging in my belly. So it's, it's a tough moment to think, what are our strategies for pulling men toward seeing the public good, seeing that the system isn't working, seeing that those leaders who say they're on their side are actually doing the opposite. Brian, you were just talking about this before around what tariffs actually do. They mean attacks on the lower income. They're hitting you, dude. They're not protecting the job because that job was never intended to come back, except in a few cases. But the vast majority, it really is about increasing the wealth transfer to the wealthiest 1%.
Yeah, that's what it did. That's what the latest big, beautiful bill did. Yeah, I mean, it's the biggest wealth transfer from poor to rich in the history of the United States. Gary and Taveeshi, we like to conclude our podcast by having our guests summarize or provide one piece of simple and actionable advice, something that they can take home, that they can use for themselves to make their lives better based on today's conversation. So I know it's a challenging question for you both to try to distill this into one simple piece of actionable advice. But if you could do it, what would it be?
I'll jump in with mine and then ask Taveeshi to jump in. I think the in this crisis of connection, to again call it that, with young men in particular, I think what they most need is this sense that somebody's got your back. And so I think stepping in with, we're so quick in our hyper wired moments that we're ranking everything, rating everything, judging everything. And I think young men just need a sense that I got your back. It's going to be okay. I see you. Let's help you talk about it. I want to be able to validate what you're thinking and feeling. So just this feeling that you know that somebody's got your back. We'll come to the policy stuff. We'll come to the more, the longer term complex stuff. But right now, in the first stage toward moving away from desperation, toward moving away from wanting to tear it all down, is a sense that I got your back. I see you. We can get through this together. You're connected to me. I'm connected to you.
Well said. Taveeshi, how about yourself?
I think it is so clear to me that we need to just kind of double down on the word care, right? Like we need to double down in all our relationships and how we raise our children, particularly our boys in the future, in how we relate to one another, how we deal with our planet and all the kind of climate catastrophes that are coming our way, right? This idea that we need to allow, foster, support, care in all its forms for oneself, like caring for oneself. We need to let men and women take time out for themselves and care for themselves. Our research shows that the more they care for themselves, men included, the better they can care for others. This idea that we need to basically degender care as a woman's and, kind of trait and personality, and understand that actually when young boys are born, if you have little boys, they are so full of like care and love, and their ability to care is so high. It's kind of incredible and how pure and innocent it is. And so if we just need to kind of keep fostering that and center it in the ways in which we raise our kids, in our school systems, in governments and policies. We just need to invest and allow care to be what guides us.
Well said. Really appreciate you both joining today.
Thanks for having us, Brian, and thanks for asking these questions. They're, for us, they're the urgent ones we've got to ask today. So thanks.
Don't leave just yet. Be sure to like and subscribe before you do. And a reminder to visit modernhusbands.com if you're looking for money and home management support in your life. Just click the Our Services button at the top of the page. Again, that's at modernhusbands.com. And many thanks to our co-hosts, our guests, and of course, all of you for joining today.